Perhaps slightly overlooked back in the day, Doom 64 stands as one of my favorite installments in the Doom series. With its reworked art, atmospheric musical score, super stable frame rate, and foreboding environments, it's one of the games that holds up best on Nintendo 64, I feel. Yet for many, it was somewhat inaccessible for years. It's true, on the PC you can enjoy a moderately faithful conversion with Doom 64 EX, but it doesn't fully capture the original in all its glory. That all changed recently when an official new conversion of Doom 64 finally made its way to modern platforms thanks to a partnership between Bethesda and Nightdive Studios. And it just so happens that today, I'm joined by 3 key developers responsible for bringing this release to fruition.
I'm Sam Villarreal, the lead programmer with Nightdive Studios.
Sam has worked on many projects from Nightdive Studios, including TUROK, Forsaken, and Blood, among others. But he was also behind a pair of projects designed to bring Doom 64 to the PC, with Absolution and Doom 64 EX. The latest official port, however, goes much further than these original efforts and seeks to replicate the game with extreme accuracy. But he's not alone.
I am Edward Richardson. I've been with Nightdive since TUROK 2.
And since joining Nightdive, Edward has worked on numerous projects focusing primarily on multiplayer and console development. But that's not all.
Yes, I'm James Haley. I'm a software engineer with Nightdive Studios. I started along with Sam in 2014 on STRIFE Veteran Edition.
James has been a critical member of the development team working on many Nightdive projects over the years and has actively worked on Doom-related projects since the late 90s. So yeah, this is basically a dream team. Now before we dive into the new release of Doom 64, however, let's step back and appreciate the original. Doom 64 was created through a partnership between id Software and Midway for Nintendo 64 back in 1997. It's the first in the series to offer 3D hardware-accelerated visuals, enabling a range of visual techniques that help elevate the game beyond the original software renderer. All the artwork was created from scratch for this version, complete with new 3D rendered models that were kind of all the rage back in the day, and these were used as the basis for the game's sprites. It's a very different looking version of Doom, but still rather faithful to that original gameplay due to its roots.
Doom 64 was originally based on the same code base as the Jaguar conversion of Doom, and also the majority of that code was also based on the PlayStation version. So Midway took advantage of this to reuse as much as they could for Doom 64. So there was a lot of enhancements and tweaks that were done, like colored lighting and full 3D polygons of subsectors in the BSB format for their levels. So they basically adapted this technology and they basically used it to their advantage on the N64. And on top of that, they completely revamped the way lighting is presented in the game. So you have colored graded walls, you got separate colors for the ceilings and floors. And then, of course, they've also support much higher res sprites and textures. So with previous versions of Doom, everything was limited to a 256 color palette. That includes all of the walls, all the textures, the sprites, and everything. But with Doom 64, they basically gave each sprite its own palette. So basically, there's a much higher range of colors to display in a scene. So a lot of the sprites they have much higher color versus previous versions of Doom.
The increased color depth is immediately apparent when you sit down with Doom 64. Walls now feature smooth color gradients, sometimes with the top and bottom utilizing different shades, leading to dramatic effects. Sprites, textures, and the skybox are all more nuanced as a result of the increased palette, lending the game a very different look compared to the original.
Basically, each level now has its own list of colors to reference from. So a sector would have like 5 different indexes, one for the upper and lower gradients on walls, and then you have like separate ceilings and floors, and even a separate color for sprites. So they've really made it really customizable to where they can just go nuts with on how to present a very atmospheric environment.
In addition, the development team overhauled certain elements of the visuals for Doom 64. For instance, the liquid textures. The original games utilize an animated texture which seems to cycle between a very small number of frames, so you get the impression of rippling water or moving slime, but it's rather jerky in action. With Doom 64, however, the liquid surfaces are handled differently, almost as if there are two layers being parallaxed against one another. It lends these surfaces a sense of fluidity that was lacking in the original game. Skyboxes are enhanced as well, with clouds that can now move independently of a different layer, such as mountains, and in some stages the sky can be flashed to give the impression of lightning strikes. Skies simply appear more dynamic in this game, breathing more life into the world. Other details you might encounter include the addition of fog in certain stages, and of course a reliance on Nintendo 64's native texture filtering features, smoothing out surfaces in the process, a key feature at the time. The game also utilizes some of the most advanced tricks available in the Doom engine, including one which enables the game to effectively present actual bridges that you can walk across. Beyond this, the entire soundscape was entirely revamped. Doom 64 uses a form of MIDI playback using rather eclectic set of patches from Aubrey Hodges. It's dark and atmospheric, lending the game a very different feel than the original, more similar to the PlayStation version, which he also worked on. Did Doom 64 really push the N64 hardware then? I wouldn't say so, but I feel it's a shining example of what can be done when the system is used well. It looks clean, and unlike many other titles in the system, manages to maintain a steady 30 frames per second update most of the time. It is the smoothest version of Doom on home consoles during that era. Yet Doom 64 remained exclusive to the Nintendo 64 for years, but starting in the early 2000s, Sam worked on bringing this version of the game to the PC platform, first as Doom 64 Absolution and later as Doom 64 EX.
So when I originally started on Doom 64 EX, originally I based it off of an existing source port, which already had everything in there. And then over time, I started re-adding some of the things that was exclusive to Doom 64, like the scripting system and support for high-colored sprites. So it wasn't like real thorough reverse engineering process that I was doing. It was just basically find all of the most significant things that was different and then put that over.
And how did this approach differ with the new conversion?
In the official release, it was basically reverse engineered from the ground up. I basically started disassembling the N64 ROM and I started just covering every little detail as possible. And James was also very helpful in helping out with bringing over some of the, since the majority of Doom 64's code was based off the Jaguar version, when he was also reverse engineering the Jaguar version of Doom as a side project. A lot of that code that he did it proved as a helpful source of reference when I was reverse engineering Doom 64, and there was a lot of things that I definitely missed in EX, like the collision system, the way objects were being handled when moving. There was a lot of things, just a lot of little subtle things that just completely passed under the radar when I was working on EX. With James's help and just steadily going through the entire disassembled, the assembly code from the ROM, I was able to get it right this time. And also, since I was also very determined to get it right, because I wanted to make sure that the demos were working as well, which was something that I've struggled with in EX. I just couldn't at the time I couldn't just wrap my head around it and figure out why I can't get the demos to sync up. And well, the answer was that the entire collision system was completely different.
And this is key. Synchronized demos serve as a sort of accuracy test. Thanks to this synchronization, though, it's now possible to more closely compare the new release of the game with the N64 original. The most obvious improvements stem from higher resolution rendering and an increased frame rate. And that's really it on the visual side, at least, which in this case is a good thing, as it demonstrates just how closely this new conversion matches the original visuals. And one of the more interesting comparison points stems from the method used for filtering the textures. Nintendo 64 hardware does not support true bilinear filtering, and instead relies on a 3-point method where the 3 nearest texels are blended together. This creates the signature diamond-like pattern visible within filtered textures. Naturally, previous conversions of Doom 64 didn't take this into account, and textures were filtered using traditional bilinear filtering, with 4 samples instead of 3, but for the new official release, N64-like 3-point filtering is used instead. The result is more accurate texture filtering that closely resembles the N64 original, but this technique is not supported natively in hardware, so how was it achieved?
Well, I kind of just ended up doing manual filtering through shaders. So instead of like the default linear filtering, I just basically had to do everything manually in shaders. Since basically the way that I had the renders set up for the remaster, I mean, basically all the resources is part of one large texture atlas. So I was able to just take advantage of that, treat everything as like a single image, and do the filtering from there. The only downside to that is that it's basically impossible to do like mip mapping or any other sort of filtering through this method. So that was the only downside to it, since the filtering is all being done manually in the shader.
Which, it turns out, isn't even an issue, since the N64 original does not make use of mip maps either. Another interesting component lies in the audio. The N64 version generates music using a sort of sound font, sound patches defined by the game, which can be played back, looped, and manipulated by the game. It does not rely on pre-recorded audio. And the same is true of this official conversion as well. The team did not want to use pre-recorded music, so instead, Doom 64 uses a synth-like playback method instead. This is also why Doom 64 makes use of Fmod, a cross-platform sound authoring middleware tool. Fmod just happens to support the necessary MIDI features required for Doom 64's music playback across all platforms. It's just another mark of authenticity here. Of course, when you first fire up this latest version of Doom 64, you're also bound to notice this logo. The Kex engine started life as a hobby project back in 2012 designed to ease testing among other things, but it has since formed the backbone of numerous Nightdive releases. But it's not a typical engine in the traditional sense, at least.
So basically what Kex is it's not considered like an actual engine like most games. It doesn't have its own entity system. It doesn't have its own physics system. It doesn't even have its own renderer. It's just basically a low-level framework that basically supports any type of platform. Okay, so basically you have three subsystems. You have the platform, the social, and then you have the graphics API. And the platform just covers like application, setting full screen, working with input, the tactile system, and then you have the social layer, which deals with Steam, GOG, Galaxy, and whatnot, and then you have the graphics API, which is DirectX, Vulkan, GNM, and OpenGL. And basically the main goal is that it's an abstract framework that can be used for other platforms. It's helpful to get things up and running quickly, for testing something quickly. Since most of the games that's being remastered, that's being ported to it, we don't have to worry about having to make if we had a renderer, we didn't have to worry about trying to make it work with how the game rendered it because we don't have a renderer. It's just we just have like just basic rendering utilities and just like a simple texture manager, and that's it. I mean, basically everything would be left up to how the game dictates how things should be rendered. It would just simply communicate to Kex's graphics API, and then that API would communicate to whatever low-level API that's currently available, whatever, if it's Vulkan or OpenGL or whatever. So the high-level portion of this API had to be consistent with how all the other low-level APIs work.
As Sam suggests then, multi-platform development is key to this release, and Doom 64 is perhaps their broadest project yet, launching on PC, Switch, Xbox One, and PlayStation 4 simultaneously. The PC and Switch versions use the Vulkan API, Xbox One uses DirectX, and PlayStation 4 uses GMN. The game does take full advantage of each machine's capabilities as well. It runs at native 4K 60 on both PS4 Pro and Xbox One, while hitting 1080p on Switch in docked mode and 720p in handheld mode. The base PS4 then outputs at 1080p, but it's the Xbox One S that is perhaps most interesting.
The Xbox One S version actually runs at 1440p.
That's right, Doom 64 is the first and only game to run above 1080p on an Xbox One S. That means if you output 4K to your television, you will see 1440p as the rendering resolution. So, how did this even happen?
Yeah, well, what happened was I was debugging it at one point. I was looking at all the graphs, and I'm like, we're using like 20% of the GPU. What happens if I bump that up? And it fit 50% most of the time, so...
And what would happen if you were to try this on the original launch Xbox One as opposed to the Xbox One S?
The Xbox One itself could probably do it as well, but I noticed that when I set the game to 1440p and I displayed it on a 4K monitor, but with the legacy GPU that only output at 1080p, it had this weird artifacting on all the text because it wasn't really... It was downsampling then upsampling, and it was losing some stuff from there. So on the original Xbox, it's still 1080p.
The game also includes plenty of nice features such as an FOV adjustment, the ability to remap controls and all that, but there is an extra bonus feature on one specific platform.
The Xbox version is the first time that we've done the keyboard and mouse input for the Kex Engine stuff. So we've got all that.
Yep, it's a feature we don't see often, but it is indeed included here. You can plug in any USB mouse and keyboard and use it to play the game on Xbox if you so desire. And some other details as well.
We've got the multi-touch gestures for the auto map on the PS4 and the Switch. We've got the keyboard and mouse support. The vibration feature. I think this is the first time that we've extensively used rumble in Kex. We generally don't have that on consoles. We did something weird with the HD rumble in that we ported over... We kind of create... The way the HD rumble works on the Switch is that it's sort of like a sound file, and it plays it back in the weird thing in the Joy-Con. And on the consoles, we play back that same file through a sort of a custom playback system. So what you get on, like the Xbox and the PS4 is sort of a reinterpretation of the same HD rumble, the same file coming through the controller.
Speaking of Switch, this is primarily where James Haley comes into play on this project.
The Switch port was my main domain, and that's been the case since I worked very heavily on the TUROK 1 and TUROK 2 ports for Switch. So that just naturally transitioned into work on this project basically as soon as those were done. And one of the things I'm most proud of, Edward already talked a little about, is the unified tactile system. This was the first Nightdive release where we had vibration support on every system, including PC. And that was one big thing I worked on. Then we also had the motion controls. That's something that I did that applies to both Switch and PS4. A lot of people were excited to see that on the PS4 because I understand it's not too common to be used in FPS games there. Some other stuff that I did was all the writing and the achievements for the game, such as the ending text for the new episode, which we kind of tied a little bit into the new series with a reference to the Slayer Testament. And I also worked on just a lot of little miscellaneous things, like there was always a problem in the original game where if you picked up certain items, you'd get a special message for them, like the demon keys, which are really important for your unmaker. And a lot of times that message would just get overwritten to where you could not read it by something else that you did, like triggering a secret area. So I added a system in there to give you like 3 different levels of messages that can appear on the screen at once. And that helps you avoid situations like that. You'll see them, they'll appear in red or yellow depending on the level of the message. And then I also did all of the stuff like the Bethesda.net integration. That was all under my purview.
So at this point we have a good idea of how the accuracy in this version of the game was achieved, and a better understanding of how each console was utilized. But I was curious, just what can you do with this iteration of the Doom engine? After all, Doom 64 differs in some rather significant ways from the original software-rendered version of Doom. So how does it compare to that original version then?
In terms of limitations, I would say, well, it's kind of hard to compare it to, because one is a software renderer and the other is a full 3D polygon renderer. But comparing with the PlayStation version, it's definitely capable of more complicated geometry. So it was definitely more powerful to render more detail in the levels and whatnot. But as far as like performance goes, or in terms of how far it can be pushed, I still think the PC version would still win, because it was basically made to support like mini sprites and geometry on the screen. Even though it did have like a fixed limit on the number of vis planes. Even though Doom 64 doesn't have vis plane limit, it does have a vertex limit, which I think is it's limited to like 3,072 vertices. They also use like a fixed list of vertices to send to the N64 hardware. So it was definitely limited in some ways, but compared to the vis plane limit, that I'm not fully certain.
But I was curious, would it be possible to create something like nuts.wad using Doom Builder 64? Edward certainly gave it a shot.
Yeah, what I did there, I did actually copy nuts.wad from one instance of Doom Builder into the modified Doom Builder 64, and it actually worked from there as a template. So you can kind of convert it, but there's a lot of there's a lot of work ahead of you.
So what's the takeaway here then? Well, it's great to finally have a new official version of Doom 64, especially one that comes so close to matching the original version, while still offering plenty of enhancements. I would go so far as to say that this is the best official conversion of an original Doom game to other platforms to date, even if it isn't actually the original Doom. And whether you play this new conversion or the N64 original, it's definitely a game worth revisiting today. It maintains everything that made the original Doom games so great, while introducing a rather dark aesthetic that just oozes mid-90s. The original levels are still brilliant, with a lot of tricks and traps to solve along the way, but there's even an entirely new episode created just for this version of Doom 64. And of course, the ultra-challenging Hectic is still available in this game as well. So whether you're new to Doom 64 or simply want to revisit it, this is a great way to do it, and it is still absolutely a game worth playing. But that's going to do it for this video, so I want to thank the guys from Nightdive for joining me to discuss the creation of Doom 64. And if you enjoyed this video, as always, be sure to like and subscribe, ring the notification bell, and follow us over on Twitter. And until next time, stay retro.
You